Welcome back to Profiteers versus the People, the show where we put our eyes in rich people's rabbit holes. And that was not a butthole reference. In this series, we are covering the Sackler family. Our main source is the book Empire of Pain. It was an excellent read, and I cannot recommend it enough. And this should be our final episode on this shitbag family and the role that they've taken in kicking off the latest never-ending string of giant American addiction epidemics.
And let's be real, like, you and I were talking months beforehand, and, like, their role is huge relative to what it's broadcast as, right? Like, they were a player in a lot of the media, but everyone's talking about contextualizing it and all that stuff. But, I mean, dude... They're massive.
Well, what's really interesting is the pattern. Because prior to this series, I knew about the opioid epidemic in a fair amount of granular detail. I'd watched a couple documentaries on it, and I knew the name Sackler for sure. But what I didn't know is that Valium and Librium were pretty much the same family. And how each generation really has either made or exponentially grown a fortune through a mass addiction of some sort. So that was new to me. And yeah.
Last time on Profiteers versus the People.
Arthur Sackler caused an addiction epidemic and did a lot of fraud.
I just took a shit in my clothes. We get it. That joke's getting old. It's okay.
Arthur got away, but his brothers stabbed Arthur in the back. And then Arthur died. Not because of the backstab, that was figurative. And then Arthur stabbed his shitty kids in the back, and so did the brothers Raymond and Mortimer. Again, figurative stabbing.
Lots
here.
of figurative
no
stabbing.
Violence.
This is alliteration. There are no real knives going into real backs here.
I don't think that's what alliteration means. But
is it not?
alliteration is when you use the same letter to start each word. It's like a rhyme mechanic. Like
got it. Okay, so that's
Abby
totally not alliteration.
Is alliteration. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's not what that is.
And then Ray, Mortimer, and their kids invented Oxycontin, which was stupid. And after some cajoling, the FDA was like, no notes, we fucking love this. But again, I said this last episode, fucking just go back and listen to it. Jesus Christ.
Just go back and listen to the episodes. We did a lot of work. It's a pretty digestible story. And on that note, crutches. C is consumer harm. R is rich parents. U is union suppression and employee abuse.
Red Bill, maybe we should say what crutches are before we start spelling them out.
That's a great idea. Crutches is our PR torture test acronym. C, we put all the profiteers on crutches. That's like our whole thing on the show. Go check it out.
We are on crutches in the start of this episode, just limping in.
Yeah, we are. Man, this is a bloodbath. Okay, crutches.
All right, crutches.
C, consumer harm. R, rich parents. U, union suppression, employee abuse. T, tax avoidance or tax evasion, often through charitable giving. The second C is child labor allegations and child endangerment. H is harassment allegations. E is egregious behavior after hours. And S is slap suits and journalist suppression. We'll be keeping our eyes and ears open for all of that stuff. And now we're good. I'm Rad Bill.
And I'm Money Mike.
And... So, we're back. And before we get into the fun stuff, let's go ahead and at least acknowledge the hellscape that's been created here, starting from within the mind of the person who gets addicted. Big tobacco got people addicted to a drug where quitting is like holding a fart in for months, which is appalling. Even if you're
That's exactly what it's like.
I know. Even
It's
if you're
horrible.
laughing at this, though, I want you to consider the intentionality of that component of the metaphor and how much levity nicotine addiction is typically met with. There's no sympathy when you're addicted to this stuff. It's regarded as part of life. It's built around a handful of choices made by the person holding in the fart. There really aren't people with whom an addict can feel safe and unjudged sharing the struggles of this addiction. It's awkward and can be painful. The Sacklers got people addicted to a drug where quitting is akin to holding your breath for a week.
And you might die. It might actually kill you. The withdrawals that are deadly are opiates, benzodiazepines, and alcohol. All three of those things, if you do them for too long and you stop doing them, not doing them can kill you.
Yep. The duration of acute symptoms is shorter, but during that time, the side effects are writhing and convulsing, hallucinating, you're itchy all over, and you're shitting your pants. It is an unbearable week of hell. When I was a kid, seeing those anti-smoking ads claim quitting smoking could be as hard as quitting heroin, I was appalled, although there is a sliver of truth to that. Acute withdrawals from nicotine last longer, but fully subscribing to this notion requires ignoring the part of heroin withdrawals that follows the acute stuff, where in essence, you're holding in the same nicotine fart for the rest of your life, rather than for a few months.
Yeah, I mean, I've shared on this podcast many times that, I have spent a lot of time in rehab facilities, kind of clawing my way out of that hole. And I'll tell you, I've met a lot of people through that experience, and the ones who never touched opiates had a tough time getting clean.
Yep.
The ones who made opiates their drug of choice, I don't think I met one person who got clean the first time. It has a biologically unique hook that goes into people that I really don't feel like I can overstate. And like to Rad Bill's point, when we think about addicts, we blame the addict, which the Sacklers did forever. They're like, it's not our addictive substances that's fucking people up. It's they're weak and they're bad.
And here's the thing. Are people not sick of the blank doesn't kill people, people kill people argument? We've got it for opioids, cars, guns, cigarettes, and fast food. If a majority of people can't use one or more of these things, then as a species, what the fuck are we? And what the fuck are the people blaming people for all of these things?
People who are the ones blaming other people are the ones who make money from those things you just listed.
Or they're the people who think they're in the right. Like, oh, you're healthy, you're safe behind the wheel, and responsible with your gun. Newsflash, no you're not, no you're not, and no you're not. Your feet are red and swollen all the time because you're ignoring the fact that you have diabetes, Frank. They're on the way to being lopped off. Responsible drivers don't need a truck that ensures that they're the only survivor if they crash. And responsible gun owners don't take assault rifles into Cane's Chicken. All right, I'm done. Sorry.
You're fine. You're fine. I think that there are pieces of that apply to our story on the Sacklers, for sure. The whole obsession with personal responsibility, absolving the responsibility of bad actors.
Yeah.
There you go. And I just wanted to finish this thought. Like I said, those who opiates were a part of their story, clawing out of that hole was a lot harder, and a lot of them fell, and candidly, a lot of them died.
Yeah.
I say that kind of to Rad Bill's point because it highlights just how helpless people can be once they're trapped. It's no deficiency of theirs. It is just that the Sacklers, in their quest to pad their already padded pockets, created one of the most addictive substances ever produced.
And tricked people into taking it.
And tricked doctors into telling people to take it.
Yeah.
So That's a very long intro. I don't
It's
even know
okay.
where the fuck we are in this script.
You're okay. I'll bring it right back. As close as something can get to being impossible to quit is where opioids are. Like, you'll get used to the feeling, but I watched a documentary years ago where the crew interviewed recovered addicts in Cape Cod, and many relapsed and overdosed after the interview where they talked about everything they lost. Just thinking about the high after years and years compelled them to the surface for one last breath, both metaphorically and literally. These are the stakes of the Civil War fought and so often lost by the hundreds of thousands of opiate addicts that oxycodone's prescription created during OxyContin's staggering 25-year run. But what exactly happened here? How much fault does the Sackler family bear, and what in our system allowed this nightmarish bullshit to carry on for a quarter century?
And this brings us to chapter 13. Just how responsible are the Sacklers?
Now, when broaching the subject of culpability for this crisis, the Sacklers have one somewhat reasonable defense that Money Mike, who's pretty well read, brought up before we began this series, which was this: we, the Sacklers, weren't acting alone, and we are far from the most influential players involved in this catastrophe.
Which, like past Money Mike said, is a valid point. But where we and Radden Keefe draw the line is where the Sacklers claim they are scapegoats. We're the victims here.
Yep.
We're the scapegoats for this crisis. And then they reference data points which indicate that their market share is a paltry 4% of all prescribed opioids.
Yeah, and while it's true that Endo had Opana, Melancrot had Roxycodone, Teva had Febtora, and a fentanyl lollipop called Actique, which is the most metal thing I've ever heard in my life. And while it's further true that J&J knew that their product, a fentanyl patch and an oxycodone pill called Nucynta, were being abused since 2001, at least the 4% figure was making some pretty enormous omissions. To reach the 4% figure, one had to look at the percentage of pills prescribed and ignore the duration of each prescription and the potency of each pill within that prescription. People took Oxycontin, compared to the others, for years. And not only did Oxycontin prescriptions start out strong, but with each refill, Purdue was pushing for doctors to prescribe even heavier doses. This was a continued sales effort. It was a campaign enacted on every single doctor involved in this process. Taking these metrics into account, potency and prescription duration, Purdue had a market-leading 27% share of all oxycodone sold, and according to ProPublica, in some states, the company was responsible for a 30% share of all opioids sold.
We have to remember, winding the clock back to Arthur Sackler and Librium and Valium, producing the product is only part of their game. It's also the incredibly aggressive and misleading sales tactics that led to all of these abuse cases. So it's not just the pill. It's also how we're pushing the pill.
Yeah, truly. And one of the scariest things about this whole story is just how small a role doctors play in how much of a drug you get.
Yeah.
And how big a role businesses and pharmaceutical interest and everyone else does. It should also be noted, although the participation of these other companies is a damning indictment of our pharmaceutical apparatus, none of the runner-up companies had anywhere near as much to do with the initial proliferation of oxycodone. After buying approval for their fancy little pill, Purdue enlisted the help of a massive sales force. Some were among Purdue Frederick's existing team of laxative salespeople, but most were hired specifically to sell oxycodone. For doing well, Purdue paid these sales reps handsomely. Predominantly young and hot, the sales force would visit doctors and bring gifts, food, and big pearly smiles. Before the Sacklers, this was not an established strategy. They brought this about. McKinsey would admit later, while consulting for J&J, that Purdue really were the trailblazers for painkiller sales in the late 20th century. On its own, these two ingredients would constitute damning involvement in a crisis. Purdue was the big player, and they created the roadmap for selling a dangerous and addictive new breed of miracle drug. Every time you hear that phrase, it should set off alarm bells.
And here's another little fun fact. Purdue's miracle drug, it wasn't even all that good.
Yeah.
Chapter 14. Stupid is what stupid makes.
As it turned out, the weakest part of Purdue's entire corporate identity was the nature of the drug it was selling. A study by Richitelli and Karbowicz on behalf of an insurance company found that the drug was among the very most expensive and the least effective in its weight class. Further, at the time of OxyContin's release, oxycodone had been around for close to 80 years. The pain relief component of this drug was nothing new. What Purdue brought to the table was the timed release casing of this drug, which implicitly served two purposes. Number one, take a dangerously addictive active ingredient and drip feed it over the course of 12 hours. This means a person is taking 2 pills a day, one in the morning and one at night, which is an incredible value proposition for those suffering from serious pain. Painkillers have always been dangerous, and 2 pills a day is pretty unambiguous. The guesswork is minimized, thus it is a naturally safer drug, theoretically. Now, I don't know if number 2 was ever explicitly stated, but if you look at panicked internal memos, it's clear that the belief, even within the company to some extent, was that the Contin system would keep supposed bad actors from accessing the drug's payload. In reality, and despite what was sworn by the sales force, the Contin casing did neither of these things. And the company knew this well before the year 2000, despite their outward claims. The therapeutic effects of OxyContin were demonstrated in internal tests to only last 8 hours, and the Contin system was pathetically flimsy. Purdue's knowledge of the latter was proven via internal memos from the late 90s. They were aware, for example, that in Canada, the company's first flagship painkiller had taken on the damning nickname purple peelers, which implies that the Contin system is basically an envelope for heroin.
Dude, I'm just thinking about this now. I bet the first person to figure out how to break the Contin system probably did it by accident.
Totally.
They were probably like taking their pill and eating or something, because that's the thing that people do. And they bit down on that pill and went to fucking Venus and were like, holy shit, I gotta tell people about
God,
this.
that felt good. Thank God Reddit is brand new and exists now.
I'm telling the entire internet about this. This is fucking
People have to know about this shit. Yeah, that's a guy on his way to work who's like trying to get some... Oh, dude, you know it is. And he's trying to get some sandwich out of the jowl part of his mouth because he's like 30 now. And he takes the pill with the water and like does another little try to get the food out of that like upper area and takes a chomp on the pill by accident. And then kaboom. Like, just to the fucking moon and back. Like, that's what we're talking about here.
He's at his morning stand-up like, oh, no.
You're right. So there it is. Purdue quickly realized and refused to acknowledge that what they were marketing was a drug that demands abuse to achieve its desired therapeutic effect. Think about that. 24 hours without pain. If the drug only lasts 8 hours... demands a third pill against the doctor's orders, and your pain is telling you that. This is booby-trapped. Otherwise, without that third pill, there will be peaks, and you better believe there will be troughs. I'm not a huge fan of slippery slope narratives, but it isn't hard to see how this could be the basis for a patient to move to a 4th pill a day. If they're playing with it, making their way to taking the third pill a day, it only makes sense that as the withdrawals continue, which keep in mind a key symptom of withdrawals from these drugs is back pain, you would take a fourth.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to assign this to incompetence.
Yeah.
I don't think that when they were covering up the fact that the pill wasn't living up to what it said on the sticker, I don't think they were trying to get people hooked. I think that was just run-of-the-mill incompetence. But that incompetence created, like Rad Bill said, I mean, that is a slippery slope narrative. The whole idea of getting addicted to something is upping your tolerance and upping your dose, which this system, it's inevitable.
It's compelling you to do this.
Yeah.
If you're not doing this, you're one of the lucky ones. Worse, after that fourth pill, who's to stop a patient from choosing to follow the inadvertent, almost advice given by the warning included on each orange bottle to prevent abuse of the content system?
Warning. Chewing OxyContin could release an orgasmic and near-fatal dose of super heroin.
That isn't a huge reach from what the label literally said. It didn't use the word orgasmic, but otherwise, I mean, this is close to what we're talking about here. However, that wasn't enough to persuade doctors not to prescribe, pushing them to favor the drug beyond the pretty salespeople and the free trips and tools was Purdue's almost unbelievable marketing strategy of offering the first month of OxyContin free to the patient. You know, like crack dealers offering
like
the first hit for free.
The first hit is free, baby!
First hit's free, buddy! Don't you want to get in on this? Yeah! To Money's point earlier, if asked whether I thought releasing this drug was stupid or evil, I'm still compelled to choose the former. Like, I see a ton of fuck it, I'm sure it'll be fine here. Like, just corporate, white-collared, screw it. What you're talking about is details. I'm a big picture guy. It's mostly reckless and stupid.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. We haven't really touched on this, but Richard Sackler, Raymond Sackler's eldest, at this point is the captain of the ship, and he is a fucking sociopath.
Oh, he's a sociopath. Like he's like the rich sociopath stereotype incarnate. It's insane.
And this isn't us like accusing someone of something. Although, why don't we go ahead and pepper in some allegedlys? Allegedly, he's a sociopath. Allegedly. Despite people's inclination to consider sociopathy as some sort of enlightened evil, it is an ineptitude.
Oh,
you are unable to consider how other people will be affected by your decisions. And for many, that leads to exile or execution. This is not something to be proud of.
No. Well, you know why? It's because, and I've never actually read one of these studies, but you see shit on the internet like, oh, people who have high sociopathic traits tend to be higher earners. People are like, oh, I want to be a sociopath. I don't want to have feelings, but you don't want to be a sociopath.
You don't want to do this.
It is a disability. Empathy and connection with other human beings is a very integral part of our DNA. We are social creatures.
It keeps you alive. You have to do that.
So
you have to
stop fetishizing the lone wolf, violent, narcissistic, useless asshole and acting like they tend to get in places of power. The only reason that Richard Sackler is in a place of power is because his daddy gave him a place of power. Do you think Richard Sackler would have made it that far as an awkward sociopath? Fucking no. That's not how any ladder has ever been climbed, ever. That's why when you meet people who have climbed ladders, they're nice because they know that when you're nice to people, they tend to have better outcomes than being an asshole. It is people who have been given things their whole lives that tend to be assholes. All right, I'm done.
Period. End of story. One of Richard's billion-dollar ideas was exploiting a loophole to sell OxyContin over the counter in Germany. a recipe for a swift and devastating end to Purdue's reign. After trying to sway Richard by warning of the human cost to no avail, a company executive was able to convince him to stand down by driving home the long-term loss of profits and the increased regulatory oversight that such a venture would bring. That's what it took. That is a weakness.
Yeah, so...
Dude.
When we say allegedly a sociopath... And also, I don't want to digress too far, but in The Empire of Pain, there's a narrative from the perspective of someone who knew Richard, like, in college. And to me, all signs point to sociopathy, but we'll throw an allegedly in there in case Richard hears this. Richard, if you do hear this, fuck you. I mean that so wholeheartedly.
So wholeheartedly. And also, oh my God, we're making it, Money Mike. This dipshit is listening to our podcast. What a huge moment for me.
A huge moment, but that really makes me think, like, fuck, how did that get on his algorithm? Am I making bad content? I don't know.
Right. On its face, this, a sociopath at the helm of a company making dangerous decisions, is already a recipe for disaster and was doomed to cause havoc before anyone knew what it was. But to understand how it got so huge and lingered for so long, we have to acknowledge the frustratingly predictable role that our system played in this debacle. You see, sociopaths, alleged or otherwise, whether they be gangsters, serial killers, or dictators, don't typically reach those heights on their own. To really make headlines, they need a system with cracks or a system with well-manicured express lanes. And as it turns out, our system is wrought with both.
Chapter 15. How this keeps happening. The salespeople appeal to the doctors, and the doctors become salespeople.
So, Richard Sackler and the rest of the Sacklers and the rest of the company and the rest of the companies controlled by the Sacklers, for that matter, latched on to the argument that in their pursuit of doing what's best for their patients, doctors aren't going to fall for some stupid ad. Now, although this line of defense seems toothless, it's a good lesson in how companies seek to offload blame. The Sacklers don't really believe this line of reasoning, and anyone who spouts this sort of narrative should be met with skepticism. What the Sacklers are really doing here is manufacturing a moment where they can offload the blame to doctors.
By playing to doctors' own, I say the word arrogance, but I don't think all doctors are arrogant, but they're saying, hey, doctors are so competent that there's no way that these awesome doctors could ever be swayed by this. So I feel like complimenting someone while you're offloading blame on them is an especially devious way to do it.
Totally. It's so cynical. In depositions later, the Sacklers were quoted as saying that they hated that their drug had been associated with this crisis. Although that argument fell flat, it was tied intimately to this very line. In saying no doctor would dare blah, 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 the Sacklers are positioning themselves to assign blame to doctors for doing what they're pretending is unthinkable. In reality, plenty of the doctors who knew the dangers of these drugs resisted their prescription, but the Sacklers saw this coming, and Purdue mounted sales campaigns that targeted the doctors who were less familiar with pain management. OxyContin doesn't pass the smell test with pain management specialists, but Purdue had no trouble selling the product with a few well-placed quotes and studies, quote unquote, to general practitioners, for example. One such study, supposedly published in a prestigious medical journal, claimed that fewer than 1% of patients who took OxyContin became addicted. This study, in quotes again, it turned out, was a 5-sentence letter to the editor featured in that cited medical journal. But a general practitioner isn't going to have the time, frankly, to verify this source or to contest it. The body is a huge and complicated thing, and not every doctor is going to be an expert in every little part of the body. And your average doctor is meeting with salespeople between cracks in their schedule. When the hell are they going to find the time to fact check what a well-dressed salesperson from a seemingly reputable company has to say?
Speaking of that letter to the editor, the author later remarked on how shocked he was by the mass scale of the letter's dissemination. He had unwittingly become a linchpin in the drug sales campaign, and unfortunately, he was one of many that Purdue looked to in their marketing efforts.
Yes. Purdue also sought the expertise of several pain management experts, again in quotes, to endorse their product and to appear at speaking events, some less savory than others. Dr. John Bonica is one of my favorite characters in this entire story. He was a professional wrestler turned doctor, which is an insane sentence and sounds like a story that would be in an episode of WWE. But he was instrumental in the creation of epidural anesthesia. And whether he sought to or not, he became instrumental in the marketing ambitions of OxyContin. Inspired by the lingering pain of his old wrestling injuries, which were numerous, he was captivated to write a body of work suggesting that 1 in 3 Americans was suffering from undiagnosed pain. By all accounts, he was a well-meaning doctor who might have been, projecting a hair. My wife, my kid, and me, and I'm in agony over here. Jesus Christ, it's an epidemic of pain. Then you had characters like Russell Portnoy, the self-proclaimed king of pain, who the Sacklers actively sought out as a revisionist for the history of their drugs. He would speak at events and defend the prescription of these drugs on TV and to the media. And when the dust settled, he would eventually sign on to multi-state litigation against the Sacklers in exchange for immunity. I'm reading a book right now called Borgata, which is a book on the mafia. And one interesting line they have in there is that the informers are never the reformers. They never reform. But anyways, with the backing and enthusiasm of doctors like these and that handy letter to the editor we mentioned earlier, most non-expert medical practitioners took the bait and prescribed the drug far and wide. In fact, while well-meaning and engaged doctors were prescribing prescriptions for 3 OxyContin a day, which is already fucking crazy, plenty of doctors began prescribing the drug to whoever asked and began running what some might call a pill mill of sorts. These were pretty easy to spot, though most onlookers probably had no idea what they were really looking at. The tell is a line of hungry-looking people trailing out the door of a doctor's office in the mid-2000s, like in Myrtle Beach, where a strip mall-bound clinic maintained a line out the door and a parking lot packed with out-of-state plates from morning until night. In 2008, a pill mill in Southern California, Lake Medical, was established, and before long it was supplying a majority of California's illicit supply of OxyContin. Through reports from police and concerned citizens and the company's own proprietary software, Purdue was made aware of both of these pill mills and many others, but did nothing to intervene.
There's a lot in Empire of Pain that I think kind of insinuates, like, not did they just do nothing, but they encouraged that shit.
Yeah, and Radden Keefe does this thing where he doesn't come out and do what we're doing, where we're talking and then we'll take a quick breather to be like, fuck that, dude. It's just, he goes, and here's a little bit more information to support the idea that maybe the Sacklers knew a bit more than we thought they knew.
Yeah, Radden Keefe is a journalist, and we are not, and that is...
Yeah. Check it out. It's a great book. Check it out.
It really is. And I will say, like I said earlier, I've watched a fair amount of these documentaries, and I thought that Radden Keefe's portrayal was much less inflammatory and much more careful, to be fair, than some of the more sensationalist stuff that I've seen. So I think that he is really being careful with his journalistic integrity, for sure.
He does this thing which I love, which is when it sounds like he's being incendiary or like really maybe exaggerating something, he will answer the next question out of your mouth and then the one after that. And it's like, okay, no, this is coming from a place of merit. However, blaming this problem on just the bad actors here is naive. Plenty, in fact, most addicts got their first taste of the drug from decent and caring doctors whose main obstacle was the massive education given by Purdue on prescribing OxyContin and the complete lack of education on helping patients taper off the drug. Also, damn it, doc, a study revealed that when well-meaning doctors aren't aware of the dangers of what they're prescribing, on average, one $20 lunch is all it takes to persuade them to change their prescribing habits. $20! Further, get it together, Rad. Further, the good ones, I have no doubt, have historically looked to the guidance of the FDA, who, you might recall, failed us in the last episode.
Yeah, like Rad Bill said, there were cracks in the system that the Sacklers exploited to create this scenario. They didn't do it by themselves.
Yeah, it takes a village to end the world. Yeah.
Well said. Chapter 15, Part 2. Alas, the underdogs are due for another ass whooping.
Rumblings about problems with OxyContin started shortly after the drug's release and pooled in a familiar pattern. OxyContin was prescribed most widely and abused most commonly in the Rust Belt states and in poorer communities in the Northeast, but that wasn't because Purdue was just marketing to the poor. That was never explicitly stated, and it wasn't their target here. In a glowing endorsement for strict regulation of these sorts of drugs, 5 states emerged significantly better off than the remaining 45 in the wake of this crisis: California, New York, Texas, Illinois, and Idaho. 4 of the 5 richest states in the country and Idaho. Up until 2004, these 5 states had what were called triplicate programs, whereas a doctor, while prescribing a Schedule II narcotic like OxyContin, had to use a special 3-layered prescription pad, where I assume ordinary prescription pads are just the 2 layers where they keep the bottom one for themselves. The 3rd copy of each prescription would be filed with the state to monitor irregularities with these drugs. As a result of the triplicate program and the accompanying paperwork and surveillance, doctors were less excited about writing opioid prescriptions and harder for Purdue to sway. So initial marketing efforts in these states were very limited. They knew this was an obstacle. They weren't going to try and get over this on the intro of the drug. So there you have it. 4 of the 5 richest states in the country are out of the equation for marketing this drug, by and large. In the remaining 45 states, Purdue relied on IMS to determine where marketing dollars should be vested. And unsurprisingly, IMS, as a refresher, their marketing software for where medications are being prescribed, where medications are needed, that sort of thing, found that the most lucrative markets would be those where pain from injuries and disfigurements, even modest ones, would impede job security, and where chronic pain can rise from years of just drinking the water and breathing the air. I'm talking, of course, about states like Ohio and Kentucky.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discourse about this already, but it would be a mistake to leave out the disparate impact of opioids on white people.
Yes.
Dave Chappelle made a very funny joke about comparing the outcry over the opioid epidemic to the stunning indifference and overall callous coverage of the crack epidemic. And while I think there's a pretty cathartic element to this, it really is just a story of 2 social institutions chronically infiltrated by corporate interests.
The natural segregation of blacks that in many cases still pervades in one form or another has made people rich. And in the 80s, it meant that the introduction of crack and the way its illicit use proliferated was able to destroy communities far away from those with a chair on the world stage. As far as the media was concerned, this is somewhere else. To the people on the radio and TV, it was something happening in a distant world. Lack of political representation for blacks, even in cosmopolitan cities, meant that politicians elected around the time won by promising to alleviate the disease of crime, itself a symptom of an illness implanted in a once thriving, though somewhat isolated community. Black Americans have centuries of precedence for not trusting doctors, though that strained relationship still plagues the outcomes of our medical system today. In the case of the opioid epidemic, it meant that they were spared to a great extent.
Yeah.
Rural white Americans, by contrast, particularly those in the Rust Belt states, have always faced some degree of that sort of isolation. Though as blue-collar jobs left our shores, the problem worsened. As unemployment has risen and union representation has diminished, it's meant that people in these regions have had to work under less favorable conditions for plateauing pay. And as nest eggs shrink, time off from work becomes a more and more expensive luxury, and people, again, worlds away from those with a chair on the world stage, have to turn to drugs like Oxycontin to continue working over the screaming objections of their chronic pain.
I think also an interesting point about the racial disparity between opioid addiction for black people and white people, it also reinforces the idea that these drugs really are coming from doctors through prescriptions. One of Purdue's defenses, again, has been, well, we're just a drop in the pot. But it seems like, if we're taking a survey, the people who are historically going to doctors are getting addicted, and people who are historically not going to doctors aren't getting addicted as much.
Yeah, it's pretty telling, right?
Yeah, the numbers are big enough that we can make a little bit of inference there.
Yeah, Oxycontin was released in late 1995. And by 1996, this was a burgeoning crisis, well documented by local journalists who were writing what was all around them, but it wouldn't be introduced to the world stage until 2001. 5 years later, when a reporter for the New York Times, Barry Meyer, received a tip and published an article on the debacle. It took 6 years for this to make it to everybody else. Though the racial disparities that defined our response to these two identical crises demand our attention, the other story here really is that no one's immune to this kind of targeting. Black Americans who didn't trust doctors were snared by an addiction crisis just the same as white Americans who did. If there is economic disparity, the poor, marginalized, and isolated will be sought as cannon fodder for new economic ventures, period, end of story.
Chapter 15:3, The Stunning Actions of Our Federal Government.
Around the time of Barry Meyer's piece, 2 prosecutors in the West District of Virginia began an investigation into Purdue. Remember, although it was just now breaking national headlines, this shit was everywhere in the markets it penetrated. Although plenty of pharmaceutical companies had gotten in on the craze, Randy Ramsayer and Rick Mountcastle honed in on Purdue specifically because Purdue seemed the most pervasive of the lot. Their sales reps were everywhere, it seemed, and stories abounded from the district about the reps pressuring the small-town pharmacists into prescribing the drugs to illegitimate patients. How exactly you do that without a gun in your hand is not made clear, and I tried Googling it too, and there's not a whole lot on that, but I'm sure Raddenkeefe had some reasonable documentation for those instances. When the 2 attorneys approached John Brownlee, the U.S. attorney for the district, about pursuing Purdue, Brownlee heartily endorsed the effort. And in December of 2002, the team sent their first subpoena for documents to the company. Predictably, Purdue responded by attempting to, quote, bury the team in paper, unquote, a technique frequently utilized wherein the conglomerate responds to a subpoena by sending millions of often disorganized documents to the team. Despite the avalanche of paperwork, the team of lawyers devised a system where they combed through each box as it arrived and sent additional subpoenas requesting related documents, sometimes repeats of what the company had already sent, right? Purdue's next move was also a predictable one. Hire a well-networked Washington attorney, Howard Shapiro, to bypass the Virginia team and go directly to the sitting administration. In short order, John Brownlee was summoned to Washington for a face-to-face meeting with James Comey, the Deputy Attorney General. It had been explained to Comey by Howard Shapiro that the Abington team needed to be reined in. But when Brownlee arrived and told Comey that it was Purdue Pharmaceutical they were pursuing and not Purdue Farms, he was just set on his way.
What the hell does Purdue Farms have with the Justice Department?
What the fuck is going on here? He took him to Washington. It was like, oh, Purdue Pharmaceutical. No, you're good. I thought he said something else. Anyway, the investigation carried on for 5 years. Unfortunately for Purdue, this system that the attorneys in Virginia devised meant that burying them in paper failed miserably. And in no time, among other bombshells the attorneys had unearthed, instructional videos encouraging the salespeople to make false claims. Reports that sales reps had been documented lying to doctors and pharmacists in all 50 states, and an organized log of notes from sales reps highlighting the kind of shit mentioned earlier.
Yeah, this is the shit you don't do if you're committing crimes.
Yeah.
Like, one was, doctor was worried about how addictive OxyContin was. I lied and told him it wasn't addictive at all. And now he's cool. Told the doctor that this was the safest opioid on the market. And he totally bought it. What an idiot, lol. Doctor at Walmart clinic is writing oxy prescriptions with both hands. Ugh, paging Dr. Dumbass, you're wanted in the dipshit wing for stupid doctors. Of course, this isn't true, but like, they did document crimes. And again, if you're going to do crimes, you need to not document the fact that you're doing crime.
Right? In the 90s, it's like, can we stop faxing each other crimes? They'd also unearthed an internal Purdue study that found that 2 of 7 osteoporosis patients suffered withdrawal symptoms even from low doses, despite the claims on the package insert. And they found an internal email from a higher-up at Purdue celebrating the FDA approval of OxyContin just 2 months after they submitted the drug for approval to the FDA. Ooh, that's not a good look. So the Virginia attorneys mapped out a plan. We can't just hit the Sacklers with these charges because the diluted corporate web the family had built basically shielded them. So let's bring felony charges on the 3 executives that have been parading around the country and defending the drug, often with lies, often under oath.
The henchmen.
The henchmen. Yes, these are folks that are henching for the Sacklers.
Yeah, they are henching hard.
Henching very hard. Howard Udell, the fiercely loyal dipshit lawyer, is hench number 1. Michael Friedman, the VP of marketing, and Paul Goldenheim, the chief medical officer, were hench number 2 and hench number 3. All 3 are soft.
Oh,
limp dick handshakes, whole shebang.
Yes.
And this plan is rock solid. The prospect of years in jail would make people like this sing like canaries. It's a well-established thing, and kind of doy. It would make me sing like a canary.
Yeah, I'm soft.
I'm a softie.
Yeah.
I'm a podcaster. Jesus.
Yeah, like I'm the definition of an armchair softie. Like
when word of this decision made it to Purdue, the company issued a clear directive to the 3 executives. Stay out of jail. We'll do the rest. And with that, Purdue's legal team once again appealed to the Bush administration, this time to the team of Paul McNulty, Bush's new deputy attorney general. Once again, Brownlee's team was summoned to Washington, but this time they were ushered into a room with 2 Purdue attorneys, Howard Shapiro and Mary Jo White. Alice Fisher, Paul McNulty's right-hand lady, and a few others in Paul McNulty's administration. The Purdue team reasserted the point previously made to Comey, that Brownlee's team was being too aggressive. These three executives didn't know anything about this. It was just a few bad apples amidst the sales team. They would have stopped if they had known. Come on. Following the meeting, Brownlee's team was notified that the Justice Department wouldn't allow them to seek felony charges against the three executives. The plan was kaput. Instead, the three executives would each be charged with a single misdemeanor, and the company would be charged with felony misbranding.
And the wheels of justice continue to turn.
Yes.
This is why we have vigilantes, folks.
This is why there are Batmans out there, or people trying to be Batmans, right?
Batmans are bad, I think, for everyone. Like, the idea of idolizing these isolated weirdos is probably bad for us as a
everybody. Yeah,
but shit like this is why people do shit like that.
Straight up, throwing out your dependence on our entire system and putting it into a bizarro rich guy who's going around kicking people's ass in spandex is fucked up, but this is why people do it.
What does that say about the system?
Yeah.
It's one guy in spandex versus a multi-trillion-dollar system, and someone's like, nah, dude, let's just beat him up about it.
I mean, this guy looks cold. It's obvious from his outfit, but
he at least gives a shit.
Yeah. Though Paul McNulty pushed hard to get the misdemeanor charges dropped, which is, again, a step above what's already been achieved, Brownlee pressed forward and saw to it that they stuck. Subsequently, he would appear on a list of AGs the Bush administration sought to fire for being insufficiently loyal to the administration. Although the scandal around that document would allow him to keep his job, the Republican Party to which he sought further advancement would primary him when he sought office, and his political career would ultimately fail. The Purdue executives would all be forced to resign, an unanticipated and painful reality for the three, softened only by the $1 million bonuses they received on the way out the door. And through corporate sleight of hand, the felony charge that would have ended Purdue's ability to partner with Medicaid, dooming the future of OxyContin, was instead given to Purdue Frederick, the company with the doo-doo pills. Purdue would continue to sell OxyContin for years. And in the ensuing years, the Justice Department would take to moronically pointing in random directions to assign blame for the decision to not allow felony charges. Alice Fisher was in the room, but she would have required the endorsement of her boss, Paul McNulty, to do this. But in interviews, McNulty explained that in actuality, it wasn't him either. I think the just thing to do here, looking at history, is to see to it that the captain of this ship is led safely from the wreckage immediately. There's already a grave shortage in captains, and the idea that this one would go down with, okay, you get it, I'm being ironic. It's his department initiative, regardless of who called the shot. This indicates a startling, almost treasonous failure on the part of whoever gave the order. And if he truly didn't know where the directive came from, this represents a catastrophic administrative failure by Paul McNulty.
Chapter 15, Part 4, Patent Law and the FDA.
After the close call in 2007, the Sacklers had a come-to-Jesus moment. More legal threats to their fortune would surely come, and the patent's life of OxyContin was fading fast, so it was time to diversify. If all their money was tied up in this one venture, it all stood to be lost, so the family got started. Almost immediately after this close call, the Sacklers began diversifying money from Purdue into tax havens and Swiss bank accounts. Between the release of OxyContin and the legal proceedings in 2007, the family, meaning Raymond, his son Richard, his brother Jonathan, and all their shitty kids, and Mortimer and his 8 kids and all their shitty kids, had diversified just shy of $130 million from the company. After 2008, the family diversified billions from Purdue.
This definitely wasn't because they knew that eventually the authorities would come running and their scheme would go kaput and they just wanted to get as much money out of it as they could. That would be
ridiculous. Money Mike, it's a classic mix-up you're having right now. We're diversifying. That's what's going on here. Yeah, we don't want all of our money to be in one pot, so we're putting it into other ventures, like Switzerland.
We're taking our money and we're making it my money.
Yes, and we're doing so fervently that Purdue will be unable to create new drugs. This is part of diversification. Next, the family sought to get into the exciting world of opioids. To gain a competitive edge over all those filthy generics companies, Purdue decided to resume the use of the dangerous and illegal sales tactics for their cutting-edge new drug, OxyContin. I'm doing a bit here. OxyContin was introduced decades ago, and they're just picking up where they left off. They got away with murder here, so they're picking it up and just continuing to do all the fucked up shit they were doing.
Yeah, they're diversifying to go sell OxyContin again.
Yeah. Also, Richard's brother, Jonathan, established a generics company called Rhodes Pharmaceutical, which produced a generic version of MS Cotton and an unfathomable instant-release oxycodone tablet.
Jesus.
Jonathan's mommy and cousin Kathy served on committees within the company as well. Around this time, Purdue engaged the consulting firm McKinsey to help them diversify. And to their credit, the folks at McKinsey came to the table with some bangers. These are real.
Push for patients to be placed on higher doses for longer periods of time. And then offer a rebate structure for insurance companies and pharmacy chains where they can receive up to $14,000 each time a patient of theirs overdoses. Oh my Lanta.
The latter one wasn't pursued. To Purdue's credit, they were like, okay, guys, this is too fucked up. Like, I feel like, dude, McKinsey's role for so many of these companies is just to give them the most fucked up ideas imaginable, and then just bury the lead.
Like, this whole thing is holy shit, Purdue is the most fucked up company ever. But goddamn McKinsey, you are really up in the ante. Like,
McKinsey came in with that, and Richard Sackler was like, oh shit, man. That's too dark.
Talk about reading the room.
I know.
Like, all the McKinsey people were like, this cat Richard, he is fucked up. He was going to be totally cool with just offering a rebate program for overdoses. Honestly, and now this is a very big allegedly, I think that if it wasn't for the rest of the board, Richard Sackler would have been like, oh, hell yeah. In fact, he would have stolen the idea. He'd have been like, that wasn't some fuck over at McKinsey. That was my idea to put patients on higher doses for longer periods of time. That's all me.
In 2010, the company introduced the innovative and very diversified product, Butrans, which was a transdermal opioid patch. Surprisingly, the product didn't sell that well. And Richard expressed frustration that the company wasn't just reaching out to those pharmacists who prescribed so much of our other stuff. Crazy thing to have written somewhere for, like, legal officials to find later. Richard probably didn't have much trouble taking his mind off of this, though. OxyContin OP, which was oxycodone with an actual tamper-proof coating, was introduced in 2010, just before the release of the failing Butrans. It sounds like this new tamper-proof coating was like a Skittle almost, where like you try to smash the pill and it just turns into like that sticky, semi-gelatinous substance. The color pattern on the outside of the Skittle fractures and you can see the jelly stuff on the inside that's still kind of firm, but like you can't gish it into a powder. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
The FDA approved a ton more aggressive marketing language, but insisted that the company conduct studies to prove the claims. Eventually, Purdue touted OP as this big, responsible move, and in contrast to all of their assurances in the past, claimed that one of the chief motivators for this reformulation was safer distribution of the drug.
Which, no more abuse. Thank heavens. But, like, here's the thing. So, throughout this whole thing, Purdue maintains complete and utter innocence, right?
Yep.
It's not our problem. We don't like that we're being associated with all of this bad stuff. But by creating this new deterrent, they're essentially admitting that the Compton Cheeto in the lock thing wasn't doing its job.
Yeah.
You know, so like, and they were really careful with how they marketed this, but the existence of OxyContin OP is, in my view, an admission of guilt.
Yeah, a damning admission of guilt. Like, these guys are ironclad.
Yes.
In their insistence that they're innocent. It had nothing to do with any of this shit. It's their drug. Their drug never harmed anyone. And then to make money, they will throw all of that out the window. Just to make a little more.
Yeah, because what Radbill, I'm pretty sure, is about to say is the only reason, not the only reason, a reason that they did this was because just like adding the Compton before, it revamped their FDA patent so they wouldn't have any more pesky generics on the market for a couple years. So they're fixing something that maybe they broke, but only because they're going to make $1 zillion doing it.
So actually, I was going to say something different. In reality, though, what they were doing was exploiting a loophole to extend the life of the patent on the drug.
Well, you know, I think we can say that twice. That's what they were doing. They're pieces of shit. Fuck
yeah,
you,
right? They're just stretching out the patent. A reformulation like this means potentially adding years to the life of this patent. In keeping with the narrative of being responsible, the company also asked the FDA to not approve any generics relying on the original cotton system due to safety concerns.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Meaning that incidentally, they would still have absolutely no generic competition of any kind. On the day the original patent was set to expire, the agency granted this request to Purdue. No OxyContin generics for the USA. Tellingly, Purdue continued marketing the original formulation in Canada for a full year following the approval in the US of OxyContin OP. What does that tell you? And focus, Rad. In a further win for Purdue, in August of 2015, the FDA approved their drug for use by children as young as 11. The press caught wind of this, and the back and forth culminated in a letter from Purdue's lawyers to the New Yorker magazine claiming the FDA made them seek approval for children.
How dare you?
This was a lie, by the way. Purdue very much chose to seek this approval, but they didn't seek it for the sake of prescribing the drug to children, which they ultimately didn't do. The one thing I will give in their defense is that they did not seek to prescribe this drug they supposedly sought was safe to children.
I truly believe that there must have been some other reason other than the moral thing. I truly believe they tried hard.
Right.
Like someone in the boardroom had to be like, Richard, we can't market this to 11-year-olds. And Richard said, well, why the hell not? Why can't we do that?
Maybe someone threatened to kill themselves if, like, you know what? We can't put that in here.
That is
Sorry.
I would say that's a great way to get demonetized, but I mean, we're not very monetized right now, gang.
Yeah. They sought the drug approval to take advantage of language in the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which would grant the company as much as 6 additional months of patent exclusivity, which, bear in mind, amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars for diversification. This is huge.
Yeah, think about that for a second, though. This legislation is incentivizing Purdue to sell OxyContin to children. Like, again,
just by and large.
Yeah, like, we're not saying Purdue's great. I think we've made that clear. But, guys...
They wouldn't have applied for this approval if it didn't extend the patent. Like, another company might have just been like, and fuck it, let's just prescribe it to kids as young as 11. That's within the cards here. They could have done it.
God, the FDA.
Yep. Well, they didn't ultimately seek to sell OxyContin to children. They did decide it was time to diversify OxyContin into markets overseas. This effort was taken up by the family's subsidiary, Mundy Pharma, whose sales, unsurprisingly, took the hell off. Ultimately, it was Kathy who came to the table with the most diversifying idea. Project Tango was her brainchild. It would be introduced to the public as treatment for opioid abuse disorder.
Thanks, Kathy, for introducing treatment for something that your company obviously had nothing to do with.
This'll work great. Yeah, thanks, Kathy.
Chapter 15, Part 5. Bankruptcy Law.
Though Purdue was able to settle and bury some big cases in the Rust Belt states for a few $100 million, and with the help of other pharmaceutical companies, were able to stall the CDC's guidance against opioids until 2016, it had become clear that the party was almost over and the lights were about to turn on. Each year, at this point, the crisis was costing the American taxpayer $80 billion and killing 50,000 people via overdose, which outpaced car and firearm accidents. The company had been aware since 2014 that they were being investigated by a handful of AGs and pursued by a series of lawyers who beat the tobacco giants in the 90s, some of whom had gained access to sealed documents from past suits. And it was becoming clear that these groups were getting ready to pool their efforts into what's called a multi-district litigation, which is what took down big tobacco in the 90s. Thus, 2018 was a big year. Maura Healey, an AG in Massachusetts, and Letitia James, an AG in New York, brought suit against the company and named the Sacklers as defendants. Dozens of other states signed on. Purdue fired its whole sales force because the patent was sunsetting anyways, though they cited a new direction for the company. And all of the Sacklers resigned from their positions within the company and stepped down from the board. The Sacklers, at this point exiled even from some hedge funds, were in full panic mode. And now, to prevent a 90s tobacco reckoning in the ruins of Ohio, sought a global resolution. David, Richard's dipshit son, met with the attorneys general in Cleveland and proposed a $10 to $12 billion resolution. The family would then admit no wrongdoing and all future suits would be put to rest. Though the cost of any semblance of recovery from the crisis was estimated to be in the trillions at this point, this appeared to be a compelling gesture on its face. Then came the fine print. None of this money would come from the Sackler family. For the family, this was a sticking point. Instead, Purdue would continue to operate but be converted into a public trust, meaning continued OxyContin sales from the company's looted skeleton would contribute a handful of those billions. Majority of the remaining amount would come from the sale of the international operation, Mundy Pharma, which the family was valuing at $3 billion. The variance in the resolution amount was there to account for the possibility of the company selling Mundy Pharma at a premium. Apparently, one of the plaintiff's attorneys helped broker the deal. But remember, he's a plaintiff's attorney, which means his firm is entitled to a portion of whatever's negotiated. What that tends to mean is that attorneys like him are less risk-averse if there's already something on the table. He can go for gold, but in cases like these, that could mean risking everything. In fact, in this case, those were the stakes. The Sacklers had an ace in the hole. If the negotiated terms weren't to their liking, and the dozens of attorneys general kept pushing, the Sacklers could just declare bankruptcy and potentially not pay a thing. The company was completely looted at this point, so the end result of such a scenario would be the AGs picking the less than $1 billion off of Purdue's corpse. In September of 2020, this threat became a reality. The Sacklers declared bankruptcy, and through a technicality, did so in White Plains, New York, where the case was presided over by Robert Drain. Though the Sacklers stressed that their bullshit offer still stood, DopeSick kicked bankruptcy proceedings off by freezing all litigation against the company. When Letitia James pressed forward, saying that the Sacklers themselves weren't declaring bankruptcy, it was just the company, DopeSick made the extremely unusual ruling that the family and the company were intertwined. Thus, all litigation against the family would be halted as well. Around this time, cracks were forming in the coalition. Purdue, who's donating money to both Democratic and Republican AG associations, sought to seize on the momentum and enlisted the help of former Republican Senator Luther Strange to further lobby the Republican Attorneys General Association. DopeSick extended the freeze on litigation against the Sacklers and Purdue a baffling 3 times, and then sought to make the ruling permanent. Following intense pressure from the Trump administration, Jeffrey Rosen, Trump's attorney general, intervened. The 2020 election was in 6 days, and Rosen let it be known that a global resolution had been reached. The company would plead guilty to a charge of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and violating the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as 2 counts of conspiracy to violate the federal anti-kickback statute. No executive would face individual charges. In what felt like the end, Congress endorsed the plan to accept Purdue Pharma's conversion to a public trust, meaning the sale of opioids would fund recovery efforts, which to us non-lawyers seems completely fucking horrifying. In recent months, though, the Supreme Court ruled that the bankruptcy filing and its shielding of the Sacklers was unconstitutional. Though a settlement will likely take years longer, to the bane of many claimants, the potential for a much larger settlement is on the table, and a real penalty to the Sacklers seems like it's a possibility.
There's hope yet. Unlike the U.S. justice system, when we do crutches, we're going to be really fucking hard on these people.
We're taking down the whole family, baby.
Yeah, fuck them.
Consumer harm. Paging Dr. Dumbass. Yes, there's plenty of consumer harm here. Rich parents, I think, goes to everyone except for Arthur Sackler. I think even Raymond and Mortimer Sackler, the elder, get rich parents.
Arthur was more like a dad than a brother for them. He set
Arthur
them up.
was more like a dad to his own dad.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well said.
Union suppression and employee abuse, this didn't fit into the story, but Knapp Laboratories, just through ridiculous and callous mismanagement, experienced a lab explosion, which claimed 5 lives and injured 40, which gets us the U for sure. Yep. Tax evasion was rampant. It's part of the whole thing here. Child labor was absent, as were harassment allegations, aside from Arthur, who we already covered and who's just kind of a creep. There was nothing explicit, no huge moment, that kind of thing. Egregious behavior after hours wasn't covered in great detail here, but the entire 3rd book in The Empire of Pain was pretty much devoted solely to the Sacklers being unbearable assholes, which is one of the reasons, again, I fucking love that book.
It's a good book.
It's a good book. Slap suits and journalist suppression was rampant. The Sacklers spent a considerable fortune intimidating journalists by hiring private investigators and trying to go over their heads to leadership. They were menaces. So there it is. The Sacklers and the system that allowed them to be monsters. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into our long-ass series on the Sacklers. We hope it was informative and fun. Shoot us an email if you feel so inclined. We're always open to tips, ideas, notes, comments on current episodes. Feel free to please check out our subreddit, Profiteers vs. the People on Reddit. If you check it out, you'll find us. And feel free to comment on that form as well if you have ideas for episodes, what have you. Otherwise, please like, comment, and subscribe. We love you, and goodbye.